Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. My guest this week on Wichita Liberty TV is Jonathan Williams, who is Vice President of the Center for State Fiscal Reform and Director of the Task Force on Tax and Fiscal Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council, oftentimes called ALEC. He works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop fiscal policy solutions for the states. Prior to joining ALEC, Williams served at the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, authoring numerous tax policy studies. His work has appeared in many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Investors Business Daily. He serves on the board of directors for State Budget Solutions, a nonpartisan good government group that pursues fiscal reform in the states. Jonathan was on Wichita Liberty TV about 6 months ago. Here he appears again to give an update on some issues in Kansas. Now, Jonathan Williams. Well, Jonathan Williams, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Thanks for having me back.
So, you're here in Kansas this week to deliver a number of talks. I think the titles are along the lines of A Free Market Analysis of Kansas, America's Most Discussed Tax Reform Effort. Another one is A National Perspective on Kansas Fiscal Policy. You travel across the nation talking to people about tax and budgets and state issues. Is Kansas really such a big issue these days?
Well, some people would like to make it into a big issue. Generally those that don't believe in keeping government limited or don't like tax cuts have been trying to portray Kansas as an abject failure over the last 5 years now, starting with really Paul Krugman at the New York Times, trickling down into many folks that just don't believe in those principles. Every time there's a bit of bad news coming out of Kansas, and of course there has been a fair share over the last few years, they try to tie that to saying, well, absolutely, look at tax cuts have caused another problem, regardless of whether tax cuts had anything to do with the problem to start with. And so you do see the news about Kansas continue to pop up in different places across the country, and that's where sometimes we have to serve as a truth squad to say, let's separate myth from fact. And that's why in the latest edition of Rich States, Poor States that I co-author with Art Laffer and Steve Moore, we devoted an entire chapter to talking about America's most discussed tax reform plan in Kansas.
So Rich States, Poor States is an annual publication of ALEC. I think it's in its 9th year or something like that, I think.
Right.
And it looks at backwards at what's been happening in each state and also has a forward-looking component as well. And there was a couple years ago, Kansas jumped up in the forward-looking ranking, but it's fallen back a couple steps in the last 2 years, I think, hasn't it?
Kansas's ranking has seen almost a roller coaster effect, right? And so where Kansas started out below average, which was really one of the motivation for enacting tax reform, is Kansas has been lagging the nation in economic growth and in migration for many years, as you know. Certainly in our metrics in Rich States, Poor States, it showed up that way. And then after the tax reform package and the marginal rate reductions, Kansas increased from number 27 in economic outlook all the way up to number 11. Was really the high water mark. And then
so we were set for a good future at that time.
Oh, absolutely. Based on those incentives and policy, these are the 15 factors that we measure in Rich States, Poor States, everything from tax rates and regulation and labor policy. Kansas came in 11th best. Now, unfortunately, with kind of the backtracking of tax reform and actually seeing the largest tax increase in state history, as some describe it, Kansas has fallen back, ironically, back to 27th again in economic outlook.
So right about in the middle of where we are on so many areas,
yes.
Right about in the middle.
And so I think that really begs the question, what can be done once again to get back into really the higher echelon of economic competitiveness?
So if we look back at what happened in Kansas in 2012, that was the year where we cut taxes. And not only did we cut the taxes on the what's called the LLC pass-through loophole or whatever, but we cut taxes for everybody that year.
Right, and it was across the board. Every single person that would pay an income tax in Kansas received a tax cut that year. And of course, you shrunk the brackets down and made it a flatter tax and reduced the rates. And that's the important piece is we study the different methods of states cutting taxes and traveling across the states and seeing this. The most important thing a state can do to make itself more competitive in tax policy is reducing the cost to work and live and do business in that particular state. And of course, as we've talked many times, states are in constant competition with each other for capital, both human and investment capital. And so seeing the price of work and savings and investment in Kansas go down like it did with the tax reform was a very important step. And of course, then some of the subsequent things that happened after that, I think muddied the waters a little bit.
And when we look at the taxes in the states, oftentimes we look at Texas and Florida as two states that have had a lot of economic growth over the decades, really, and they have zero state income tax. But people in Kansas will say, no, Texas, they're on a pot of oil. They get all that money from that. Texas, the tourism out to Yin Yang, they get all the money from that. But in actuality, both of those states spend less per person than Kansas does too, don't they?
And significantly so. You compare Kansas to the states that don't tax income, and there's 9 of those across the United States, the biggest being Texas and Florida, as you pointed out. And the difference is significant, the spending. And also, looking at the economic growth, the premium that's associated with being a no-income tax state is significant, whether you're looking at population growth or wage growth or income growth, even job growth. The no-income tax states for many, many years have had a premium just because they've been more efficient, because they have to provide the same basic core bucket of government services that any other state does, but they do it at a lower cost and a better value for taxpayers. And at the end of the day, that's the model I think that most states should be following.
When you talk about economic growth, I mean, population growth is not exactly the same, but related to that. In my lifetime, I can remember we've gone from 6 United States representatives in Kansas down to 4, and I think we're on the cusp of perhaps losing and going down to 3. So that really illustrates how other states have grown much faster than Kansas has over the decades.
Well, and that's right. And there's been a really big trend that we've highlighted in Rich States, Poor States for years of just how Americans, as we like to say, vote with their feet or vote with their pocketbook and go to places for better economic opportunities. And the numbers are really stark in that the states that have the highest tax rates, highest tax burdens, continue to lose hemorrhage population really to the states that have the lowest tax burdens and lowest tax rates, or altogether avoid an income tax, for instance. And just in 2015 alone, more than 760,000 Americans moved from one state to another. And why do they go? They go for search of better economic opportunity. It's pretty simple.
760,000, so that's like 1 out of every 3, or I don't know. It's a lot of people, in other words, that is. So, and I think we know that what's interesting, you look at studies of how much it costs to rent a U-Haul trailer going one way from various places.
Exactly.
You can't get one, from out of Texas to somewhere, I think, if I'm thinking right, but they'll almost pay you to drive one, I think, back from Texas to California, I think, because they need them there because so many people are leaving California.
It's all supply and demand. It's Econ 101.
Exactly right. Okay. Well, Jonathan, hold on to those ideas. We're going to take a moment off for a commercial break here on Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me here this week, Jonathan Williams of ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. So in 2012, we did a good thing. We passed some lower income tax rates. They took effect on January 1st, 2013. And then what happened in Kansas, if you could help us with a little bit on a history lesson from an outsider's perspective.
Right. So, then what happened, of course, is there was a bit of probably over-promising on what the tax cuts would deliver
shot
right away.
Shot of adrenaline.
That's, shot of adrenaline, the famous line.
Yeah, that's going to be on Governor Brownback's tombstone, I think.
Yeah, and unfortunately, in theory, that is completely correct. When you cut taxes, it's going to bring more economic activity to the place where you cut taxes. All holding constant in just basic Econ 101. However, there's a lot of nuance there in terms of the timing of when you can expect the benefits from tax cuts. And studies are all over the map on this, but I think kind of the consensus is that many times it takes 3 to 5 years at the minimum to start seeing some of the supply side effects kick in, because at the end of the day, businesses or individuals just don't pick up and move, let's say from Alaska to come to Kansas overnight because Kansas cut a couple of points off its income tax. But over time, when businesses are determining the rate of return of investment on particular projects, and let's say Kansas is in a bid versus New York, those decisions do come into effect.
And it's interesting at the national level. Well, so for people in Kansas who criticize Governor Brownback, saying, well, the tax cuts haven't worked yet, I look back at what President Obama told us would happen with the stimulus bill in 2009, and I think almost everybody agrees that, we've had a sluggish recovery. Wasn't it 2011 that was the summer of recovery?
Right.
That was, I think, when Joe Biden went around the nation in the summer, says, yeah, the recession's over. And for a lot of people, it doesn't feel like the recession's over yet.
Well, this has been the weakest recovery nationally that we've had from an economic downturn since World War II. So people maybe in some parts of the country are seeing some good signs, and the market has continued to do fairly well, especially recently. But there's a weak underlying problem there in terms of the general economy. We should have been seeing much, much stronger growth coming out of the national downturn than we did. And that really does pay a price for a lot of individuals and different sectors that continue to struggle, not to mention the struggle with oil and gas and with agriculture, with aviation, which plays a really interesting part of this Kansas tax reform story and some of the sluggish growth that you've seen here in Kansas. When you separate out some of those struggling industries, for instance, the tax reform and overall economic growth appears much, much better on average.
I just gathered some statistics from states across the country, and I don't have the visualization quite ready, but a year or two ago, some months Kansas was running $8 million below the previous month the year before in severance tax collections from gas and oil. So $8 million a month is about $100 million a year, and that's a lot of money in Kansas.
Yeah, that might be a rounding error in Washington, D.C., but it's real money in a state like Kansas. And, that does play a big effect into when lawmakers come back and have something like that hanging over their heads to the decision-making process. Now, I would argue that more budget prioritization needed to happen instead of what ended up happening with the sales tax increase and some of the discriminatory taxes on, let's say, vapor products and cigarettes, which was very counterproductive. But, overall, we can't have a discussion really holistically without considering things like the severance tax shortfall.
And then just the manufacturing industry in Wichita, so much centered around aviation, that's been sluggish to recover, although I think there are some good signs, and hopefully that will continue to grow. Now, you mentioned, I think, a bit about spending, but before that, when we did the income tax cuts, Kansas had quite a bit of money in the bank. And for 2 years in a row, Kansas used over $300 million each year from that bank balance to continue the upward trajectory of spending, even though tax revenues did decline a bit there. And I realize when I'm doing this, you know what they call that, Jonathan, don't you? It's an Arkansas PowerPoint. So. Anyway, so we did some spending. We had a bank balance that shielded us from having to deal with realities of spending, I think.
That's right. And at the end of the day, states need to balance their budgets. They need to make sure expenditures and revenues come in line. Don't look to Washington, D.C. to get the way to do it, because we, of course, don't balance a budget in Washington. But at the state level, they need to. And that was probably the Achilles heel of the overall reform package was, while some very, very good things were going on the revenue side of the equation in Kansas, on the spending side, it was a much worse outcome. You saw record spending happen, for instance, in general fund, in education spending. You've got these myths that continue to be perpetuated across Kansas and across the other states that Kansas's education system has been decimated by tax cuts. But you look at it, and total aid to education has continued to hit records the last few years. So there's really a big gulf between the revenue side and the spending side of the equation. And lawmakers just, I don't think, were as serious as they needed to be when it comes to prioritizing spending.
And then after those 2 years where we spent down our balance, it was pretty much all gone, and that's where we did what I think you called the biggest tax increase. Whether it's actually the biggest or not, they really blinked, I think. Instead of thinking about how do we bring spending into line with revenue? They raised taxes.
Right. And, Dave Traubert and Kansas Policy Institute talk about just a one-time adjustment early on in state spending of under 10% could have completely solved the entire issue on the spending and revenue shortfalls that Kansas had seen. Or you look at the Alvarez study, for instance, that outlined something like $2 billion in savings over 10 years. That wasn't seriously considered after the report was released. So, so many things like that could have been done instead of going back to taxpayers and asking for more.
That was really $2 billion over just 5 years. So that
years,
could have been it wasn't all equally cheered, but that's around $400 million a year, which is kind of, I think, what our structural imbalance is. But I would say, we did that efficiency study. They paid for it last year. The results was presented this year. I'm thinking, why along with the tax cuts didn't they also fund that efficiency study at that time? That would have given us time to think about these things and bring the changes in slowly and gradually, and I don't want to say at leisure, but in a reasonable way. And now, we're really gnashing at our teeth really to figure out all sorts of projections saying, next year's legislative session is just going to be a bloodbath. And this doesn't seem like much of a way to run a state.
Well, it's unfortunate, and I think there's a lot of things that can be learned of things that could have been done better in terms of matching spending to taxes. And of course, that's the cautionary side of the reform. But it's important in that kind of the critical side of things that we don't lose the overall focus, which is cutting marginal tax rates is going to be very good for Kansas in the long term. They just need to come back and now match it up on the spending side.
Well, very good, Jonathan. Hold on to that idea for just another moment. Let's take another break on Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, Jonathan Williams of ALEC. So, is a takeaway here that it's pretty easy to cut taxes? I mean, you can even get Democrats to agree lots of times to cut taxes. Ronald Reagan got Democrats to agree to cut taxes, but he had trouble cutting spending too, didn't he?
That's the root of the issue when it comes to state fiscal health long term, is you need to cut spending, and that's the political heavy lift for so many people, is that it's easy to give away candy. It's not so easy to deliver difficult news when it comes to taking away things that maybe people have been lobbied on for many, many years, things that people have taken for granted that have always been in the budget. But what's the first question when the family or a business has a shortfall? Is this a need or is this a want? And if that discussion, the prioritization of government spending discussion doesn't happen, all of a sudden you do find yourself with some very painful choices, which are increased taxes. And of course, that's what we realized here.
Yeah. Now, there is a state, I think, that's notable in that they cut taxes as Kansas did, but they also did something else that made their state work a little better, and that's North Carolina.
Right, and that was a huge tax cut in North Carolina. Every single taxpayer.
Do you remember what year that was?
It was just about the year after Kansas.
So it's around the same time.
That's exactly right. So there are almost tax cut parallels that have happened between North Carolina and Kansas. Now the results in North Carolina have been much more encouraging when it comes to the overall economic growth picture. Of course, they're not so heavily dependent on some of the industries that have suffered that Kansas is, but they continue to maintain a AAA bond rating, for instance, after tax cuts. So I know that's one of the criticisms, to say you can't cut taxes because you're going to kill your bond rating. Couldn't be further from the truth, as long as you keep spending in check like North Carolina did. And that's really the basic story there, is spending was kept in check with taxes, even as very significant tax cuts were being implemented in a place like North Carolina.
Do you know what politically was different there than in Kansas that allowed them to trim their spending in line with revenues?
Well, I hate to speculate too much on some of the motivations of the legislators, but I think perhaps they learned, from seeing some of the difficulties in some states that didn't restrain spending when they cut taxes. But then, secondly, you had people like being led in the executive and the legislative branch both committed to saying we need to do this the right way, we need to do it in a balanced way. You had a state budget director, Art Pope, former state lawmaker who had been around for many, many years and had seen these cyclical issues kind of play out in other states, and I don't think he wanted to make the mistake that so many states do fall into that trap of not controlling spending.
Well, we have a lot of legislators who have been in office for decades too, so I wonder why they don't learn some of these lessons too. You mentioned something there a moment ago, which is priorities or something like that, and I think one of the things that ALEC has presented as an alternative or a toolkit that states can use is something called priority-based budgeting, and it's oftentimes said in Kansas, we take a look at what we did last year, and if the number of students go up, we just increase spending by the same amount. And programs perpetuate themselves like that. But priority-based budgeting, could you explain a little bit about that?
Well, it's the concept we are really encouraging states to take a look at, because using the old budget approach, which is just taking last year's budget and then adding some sort of inflation and caseload increase and getting this year's budget, where there's no holistic discussion about needs versus wants, or do we have enough money even to have these discussions, we're encouraging lawmakers to look at it in a holistic approach to say, what are the core functions of government? And let's fund those things well, because that's what state government set out to do. But what about the things that are not core functions of government? Can they be done by the private sector? It was in the old days, it was the Yellow Pages test, which is if you can find a product or service in the private sector, they probably do it at a higher quality and a lower cost than state government can do it. Maybe today it's the Google test, but why would state government, for instance, be competing with the private sector to provide goods and services? That's an easy one. But a place like Washington State, not considered a conservative bastion by any stretch of the imagination, did this about 15 years ago, the exercise of priority-based budgeting, and they saved a couple of $1 billion and avoided could have been a massive tax hike, because they went through this process of systematically saying what's a need, what's a want, how much money do we have, and how can we properly prioritize the money that we do have so we don't have to go back to taxpayers and ask for more. Just an example there is they asked agency directors to come up with mission statements as to what success looks like, because that's a key question, of course, that businesses have to operate with, but so many times that question doesn't get asked in the public sector, and they saved a couple of $1 billion by going through this framework, and it was done on a bipartisan basis. So we think it's a great new way for states to look at how to create a taxpayer-focused budget.
And different political ideologies are going to have different answers. I think who was it said that the measure of the success of a welfare state is not how many people are on welfare, but how many get off to lead more productive lives. But not everyone agrees with that, I don't think.
Well, one of my favorite political philosophers out there, Thomas Sowell, will say, the first law of economics is there's this thing called the scarcity of resources. The first law of politics is to ignore the first law of economics, unfortunately, and that's why we find ourselves in these problems.
And these fiscal issues really kind of raise their head more in states than at the federal government, because as we know, the federal government has two powers that most states don't have. Well, no state can make its own money up out of thin air.
And
the federal government, the federal government does. But the ability to borrow to finance current spending, states can do some tricks that make that happen once in a while, but nowhere near the scale that the federal government does.
Well, that's right. It's the printing press issue. It's the borrowing issue. Now, states like California and Illinois kind of skirt the line a little bit and get close to playing those games. And you even see it here with, for instance, skipping pension payments and some of the games that can be made to shift around the timing of expenses. But overall, right, states are set in more of a rigorous situation. And that's generally good for taxpayers. Now, obviously, there's some things to be done, like priority-based budgeting, like making sure that pension payments are made on an annual basis, or things like Tabor in Colorado, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which controls the growth of government spending and makes sure government doesn't grow faster than the private sector. So there's lots of things states can do to kind of enhance the overall balanced budget requirement that they have.
And I know that ALEC is involved in many states and has all sorts of publications, the rich states, poor states, very interesting each year to see where your state's coming out, what's going to look forward, plus all the introductory material. The essay by Dave Traubert this year of Kansas Policy Institute was very good about tracing what's happened over through Kansas throughout the years. I think there's like 60 footnotes from news sources, so it's not just him making up this stuff. And then things like in Colorado, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. We've tried that in Kansas, didn't get anywhere with that, but maybe it's something we can do. But Jonathan Williams of ALEC, we are out of time for today, so thanks very much for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV, and thanks for coming to visit us in Kansas.
Absolutely. Good to be back with you.
We'll see you again next week. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV.